Hi, everyone. I am Wendy Batts here with my co-host and friend, Dr. Marty Miller. And on the Master Instructor Roundtable, we are talking about the 5 common mobility drills that we do.
Yes, we are going to go over what we think the top 5 are. Obviously, you may have more, but we're going to give you insights on why to use them, how to make sure they're done correctly, and some little tweaks just to make sure that you can use them with any client that you have coming in to your sessions. So make sure you like, follow, and subscribe. Look forward to seeing you on the episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of the Master Instructor Roundtable. I'm Marty Miller here with Wendy Batts. Wendy, how you doing?
I'm great, Marty. How about you?
Good. Wendy, this week on the Master Instructor Roundtable, we're going to go into the top 5 mobility drills. And we're going to go into them a little deeper. A lot of people see mobility drills. They understand the importance of mobility drills, but they're probably doing them even just slightly wrong or maybe wrong altogether. And then the value's not going to be there. So that's the topic for today. And I really do believe that after this, our listeners will have some key takeaways that they can apply starting tomorrow.
I agree. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about, Marty. So we're going to define what mobility is. We use it, and unfortunately, I think sometimes it's a buzzword. So we really want to kind of define when we talk about mobility. Most people just say, oh, it's range of motion, but what does that really mean? And we're going to go through that. We're going to discuss some red flags. We're going to review the top 5, especially in our opinion, common mobility drills, and discuss the intention and attention to detail and why that matters. Super important.
No question, especially for someone who needs these mobility drills. I can tell you I feel a big difference when I'm doing them properly or I'm really not hyper-focused on the small details. So 100%. Let's get into it. Now, Wendy, of course, any of these mobility drills, we're going to talk about doing an assessment first. So that's kind of a given. So don't just do mobility for mobility's sake, but these 5, we could probably safely say a lot of people will have restrictions in these areas, but we'll probably talk about it throughout. We'll talk about it at the end, but always start with your movement assessment. But Wendy, mobility isn't just about movement. It's about the quality of movement. And when you look at that, the truth is that quality matters more than quantity. A lot of people can show excessive ranges of motion and they don't realize that they're compensating from their low back or other areas. So we're really looking at, when they're done with poor form versus good form. And we want that true intention behind each movement.
Well, and to your point, when you're talking about assessments, guys, remember, if you've gone through the corrective exercise specialization through NASM, we teach you a lot about going through, especially in the CPT, the transitional movement assessments. So the overhead squat and, if the arms start to fall forward, what does that mean? What muscles are overactive and underactive? But remember, in the CES content, we're taking it even a step further by doing these mobility assessments to either show, is it a range of motion restriction or a muscle weakness? So when you're doing some of these mobility assessments, we're looking at flexion and extension, trying to see, are we at proper range of motion? And if not, what's happening? The second part of that is we have someone lie down and go into, or even standing, I guess, go into internal rotation and external rotation to see, do they meet the guidelines? And if you haven't gone through the CES and you haven't looked at the mobility drills, they took the goniometer out because some people were really struggling knowing which number to read. When visually you could actually say, if you're seeing it fall to this point or this point or this point, it's either a pass or fail. So pass means they can do it without restriction. Fail means they can't get to that optimal range of motion visually. And then that lets us know, remember, if it's a pass and they have good range of motion, but they didn't do well in the movement side, that it is going to be a weakness. If they showed compensation, meaning their arms fell forward or there was something going on in the upper body complex, and then they failed the mobility assessment, meaning they were going into external rotation and instead of their arm going flat against a wall, or if they're lying down flat against the table, they didn't meet the parameters of a pass, then we know that it's an overactive muscle that's not allowing that proper range of motion and movement.
Yep. Thanks for pointing that out, Wendy. So let's jump in here and look at what is going to kind of look at talking about red flags, right? Is these things that we have to keep an eye on, these compensations. So Wendy, you did a great job talking about it. It's active controlled movement through that full range of motion without compensation. And when you look at that, we're really talking about the nervous system. Can the nervous system control maybe not just that joint, but maybe multiple joints, depending on which drill you're looking at here? And then mobility gains stick when there's control under load. And for example, I'm working on my left shoulder external rotation in a neutral position. If I had a bigger screenshot here, you'd see that I'm a little bit more in external rotation on my left shoulder. Now, passively, you can get me there, but actively, I can't get there myself. So I have to keep working on the strength in those ranges of motion that I'm trying to gain. So that's that mobility. So red flags of bad mobility practice would be just kind of hanging out, right? Not owning the position, controlling the position, no neuromuscular control, right? Because some of these you have to work yourself into the position and actively strengthen yourself as you go into these positions. As you'll see in the picture here, she's working on hip internal rotation. You can tell she's kind of hanging out. She's not sitting towards 90 degrees. If she could, she does have good 90-degree rotation, or 45 degrees internal rotation, I would say, on that right leg. But you can see that it's not an actively controlled position. You're not forcing the repetitions. You're not rushing them. And then, of course, you have to have core stability and proper breathing and bracing techniques throughout.
And again, I think sometimes we take this for granted, because think about the shoulder joint. You've got obviously your humerus, that is the bone, your upper arm bone, and then it sits within the shoulder capsule. And it is very shallow. So that's what gives us the range of motion, or what we call the degrees of freedom, to be able to swing in big circles because of it sitting so shallow. So when we don't have good mobility, because there's a restriction, meaning a muscle's overactive, or because muscles are weak and allowing other, like passively to move when it shouldn't be moving, instead of doing the stability component of the shoulder itself. I mean, that's one of the things where I think the shoulder gets tricky. And so if somebody's ever had a frozen shoulder or ever had a shoulder injury and you're lacking mobility, you realize how many things you do with your shoulder when you're limited and you can't do it. It is not a good thing. It's not a good thing, Marty.
No, I would definitely say not, since I've worked on people with frozen shoulders. So Wendy, I'll let you kick this off here first. Is what I guess everyone has kind of coined the term, the world's greatest stretch, or that lunge and rotation.
And I love that it's always been termed that. When we always say the world's greatest stretch, there's not very many people, especially in the fitness industry, that's like, I've never heard of that, or I don't know what that is. This is one that we use very often when we're talking about dynamic warm-ups, because it is a multi-joint type of movement pattern. Obviously, we're stretching and pausing in different areas. So it's awesome for the thoracic spine, because we are lifting up and kind of reaching back. It's awesome for the hip, because we're in that runner stretch type position, if you will. We're trying to see, again, when somebody comes out of it, if they sit up before they step forward, we're really getting a lot of front hip stretch. So we're really focusing on that. And then, of course, we're looking at hamstring mobility as well. Can someone's back leg completely go straight, or is there always a bend in the knee? So that's giving us a lot of cues as a trainer too. How well is this performed? What type of compensations might we see? And then it just gives us even more information about, does their foot turn out, and what's happening on their back leg when they're doing something else, because the concentration isn't necessarily on their 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. They're really focused on doing the movement correctly. So if we go back to the slide and we really focus on what are some common mistakes, it's definitely going to be overarching the low back during rotation, especially if those hips are tight, letting the front knee collapse inward. So again, they are stepping into a lunge position. So as they go into thoracic rotation, oftentimes that front knee may collapse forward or inward, if you will. And then, of course, running or rushing through the movement. Again, this is a dynamic warm-up. So we're working through available range of motion at each joint that we're really focusing on. So, or each section of the body, if you will. So you want to make sure that you're moving under control, you've got good breathing techniques, and you're really intentionally watching what you're doing and ensuring that it's done correctly. So if you do notice some of these common mistakes, some cues that are easy kind of quote fixes for people to kind of understand, is we tell them to brace their core. I often say more draw in, but bracing is something that some people may understand easily, because if you kind of brace your core and you go through this, then we're going to make sure that we're not arching that lower back. Keep your back leg active. So once again, you don't want to just usually when we do our lunging pattern, we focus on really loading that front leg. During this type of stretch, it's good to have load on the front and the back. But if you say keep your back leg active, it's really contracting your quad, trying to get more of a stretch if you're trying to straighten your leg, or if you go into that bend, go ahead and let it bend. And then on the way up, you're adding that contraction. You're really trying to squeeze your glutes and stabilize the pelvis. And then of course, exhale as you rotate to really kind of get through that rib cage, right? Or the thoracic range of motion that we're trying to. So we're trying to think about diaphragmatic breathing. We're trying to move the ribs. We're trying to get rotation through the thoracic spine. So any of those are ones that Marty, I know you commonly use as well. But all in all, as long as they can maintain the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints and they do things under control, this is an unbelievable dynamic warm up.
Yeah. And I use it also more in a controlled manner where I'll hold this position. So a couple modifications, it could be that you use a yoga block under the hand that's on the ground. Not everybody can get into that position. If you're not using a yoga block and you force a person to get to the ground, you will have compensations elsewhere. Secondarily, I will allow people to bend the back knee because sometimes they can't support their full body weight yet. There's nothing wrong with that. And then the other thing is, I'm going to say this might be more with the men. The knee's not going to collapse in as much as because of a tight posterior capsule in the hip, the knee might abduct, which is okay if you have to allow that, but you'd want them to work towards keeping their knee in line. So some people might collapse in, some people might go out, just like in your bridging. Just pay attention to it. So those are some kind of modifications you can use as well.
Yes. Let's talk about number 2. So number 2, when we talk about the 90-90 hip mobility drill, again, so this is one that Marty showed in the first, the first picture when he was saying it looks like she's not really intentional trying to get into it. This is an unbelievable mobility drill that I use very often with a lot of my clients, especially if you're working with golfers or people that actually do sports that require a lot of rotation. So tennis players, golfers, just to name a few, because you can think this is something that somebody can do everywhere. I always call them, we're going to do our leg windshield wipers. I don't know why, but that's just kind of what I do, because you start at 90-90, you hold it, you slowly go into where your legs or knees are pointed straight up and down, and then you end up onto the other side. So you're really trying to get deep within that stretch. And this is really great trying to work on internal and external rotation when oftentimes if there's instability at the lumbopelvic hip complex, right, then we're going to notice too that they're going to be struggling to get into these positions where both of their legs go straight. So when you're going back and we're kind of thinking about some common mistakes, again, you're slouching the torso forward or back. You're letting the knees shift out of line with the hips, because again, we're trying to keep everything ideally lined up. And then they're just going fast from side to side. Anybody can do things fast. That's why, especially through NASM, we focus on eccentric contractions first. It's because it's not about momentum. It's about like Marty said in the beginning, the quality of the movement patterns. So again, you want to grow tall through the crown of your head. If somebody is slouching through their torso, you want to drive both knees into the floor. So we're not just dropping or flopping, if you will. And slow is strong. Move like you're in water. So you just want to take everything piece by piece. But this is an awesome mobility drill specifically for the hip, but where you're going to get a lot of benefit out of it.
Yeah. And we could have spent more time, and maybe we'll come back to these based on your feedback. There are progressions and regressions as well, or parts of these that you can do. So don't forget that you should have them foam roll, massage gun. And like, for example, if you're watching this online, you'll see the position at the top, the 90-90. Maybe you do just, an elevated position, or maybe you have to work your way into that. I would have to stretch my hip flexors out first if I wanted to get that pigeon position that you'd see in yoga, which is part of this. I'd have to get my lumbar spine a little more mobile before I would start with this position. So we're giving you some of the most common, but also think about the progressions as you get somebody ready for this. For me, this is not the first mobility drill I hit. This would be after my soft tissue work, after some more targeted individual stretching on single joints, and then I would move into something like this.
Oh, 100%. I mean, look at this kind of like the dynamic component, because there is movement to it, right? I mean, it's controlled movement. It's through available range of motion. But as Marty said, if you're going through and you're even looking at the template, yes, you're always going to want to inhibit. You're always going to want to lengthen. And then you're going to get into some movement patterns that are going to help you either get further into these stretches over time, or at least, to start, like you said, Marty, start where their range of motion may not be where both feet are going to touch or both legs will touch the ground. And so I always call them mini windshield wipers at that point. So they may have to place their hands behind their back. But as you can see in the bottom picture, he's kind of slouched back, his shoulders are rounded, his head is forward. You can lean back and then start to get yourself into better range of motion and then start to sit more upright. So just know some of this does take time, but these are ones that if you haven't been integrating into your program and you know that they want to play certain sports, or you know that they're lacking internal, external rotation, this is an amazing one to do.
Couldn't agree more.
So Marty, before we go into number 3, which I'm going to let you take over, I want to say that this week's episode of the Master Instructor Roundtable is brought to you by NASM 1, the membership for trainers and coaches. Members enjoy unlimited access to hundreds of career resources, get the Edge app to schedule and program clients, enjoy half off all certifications and specializations, access free CEUs, and more. All of this for just $35 a month. Go to nasm.org/membership to learn more about NASM 1. All right, Marty, talk about cars in a different way than most of us usually hear.
I would say the cars like your little son Braden likes, or the cars that all 3 of my grown men sons like, right? Mm-hmm. So number 3, shoulder CARS, CARS, which stands for controlled articular rotations. I will never do the justice that this one would do if you see the video on it. There's plenty of videos out there. We have a YouTube link you can watch. I would say the majority of the ones that I scanned were good. Just always go back to what we tell you here, and does it make sense from the kinetic chain standpoint, checkpoints. So when we look at the shoulder and the hip, so you're going to see there's some commonality here with these mobility exercises. Even the world's greatest stretch has a lot of hip component. The last one, the 90-90, is predominantly hip. These ball and socket joints can get very restricted very quickly. And when you lose that 3-dimensional 360 degrees of rotation, bad things can happen. So the shoulder is no different than the hip. So the step-by-step, so if we're looking at the right arm, you'll see a picture. Again, this is a multiple, a sequence of movements, but we'll walk through it. So you start with your arms by your side. And let's just say we're doing just our right arm, for example. You would slowly raise your straight arm in front of you, which is shoulder flexion. You keep that palm up and your bicep facing towards your ear as you reach overhead. So you're going into external rotation. You go as high as you can without arching your back or shrugging your shoulders, just like we do if we were doing overhead pressing activities, etc. From there, now we move out of the flexion phase into internal rotation and extension. Once your arm has reached whatever your normal overhead level is without compensation, you start to rotate the shoulder back inward. Your palm begins toward the outward. I wish I had a bigger screen. As your thumb rotates down and back. So now you're going into shoulder extension, which you all know what that is. So you keep moving your arm in a circular arc behind your body as far as your range will allow. Again, without the low back arching, head coming forward, etc. At the end or the bottom of the arc behind you, your palm should be facing away from your body with the back of your hand close to your side. And then you can repeat coming back through from there, or just start over. So the key thing is you're going through the full ranges of motion that the shoulder can do. Flexion, extension, internal, external rotation. Of course, there will be some slight abduction in there and some adduction, because abduction, it has an external rotation component to it, or external rotation has an abduction component, and internal rotation will have an adduction component. But it's really getting that joint to articulate from internal, external rotation, help stretch out the shoulder capsule as you go through flexion and extension. Very easy to do. Don't need weight with this. maybe for me, who's been doing this forever, I do like a lot of Indian club type of exercises that do mirror some of these, but maybe 1 pound. This is just to kind of lubricate the joint, get yourself through those normal patterns, because unfortunately in fitness, people like to work just in a pressing position or just shoulder abduction or an upright row. And they don't really get that articulation of the ball and socket joint unless they're doing the old school PNF pattern. So I thought we'd throw this in here to kind of spark some interest and make sure you go do your homework to check these out. These are phenomenal warm-ups anytime you're doing upper body progressions.
100%. I mean, I think one of the things too, when we're going step by step, what Marty just said, the next slide's going to be talking about reversing that motion. But I think to your point, Marty, when we were saying exactly what you were saying, we do so much flexion, extension, lateral raises, military presses, or overhead presses, however you want to term it. But I don't see a lot of circumduction type movement patterns, so circular movements. And because we're just like, it's kind of weird if somebody's running around like the gym and they're like doing big arm circles, like we used to kind of make fun of it. And it's mainly because people are doing it fast and it doesn't make sense. If you're doing something like what we're showing you here, it is a step by step, and there are pauses in between each rotational pattern to get through that full circle. So when you're going through circumduction, same thing with the hips. When you're thinking about that, because the ball and socket is a lot deeper, there is something called like the seven movement hips. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that, but it's actually really going into flexion, extension, forward and backward movement patterns, and then into different circles. And the circular motions with my clients get them every time, because we don't usually do that. We think of circular motions just sitting on a bike, and that's in the sagittal plane. Mm-hmm. If they're laying down on their side and they're having gravity actually start to work with that, it's extremely difficult, especially if you don't do that. So when you're going through and you're thinking about adding different things in for your clients, like you said, Marty, these are phenomenal drills to do. But as you go and if you're watching this, you're going to see the step by step. So exactly what Marty just said, remember, you're going to reverse that movement pattern to return back, obviously, to where you started. And then Marty, when you do this, how many do you normally do?
It depends on the person and the client, right? Because as you said, as we start this, their endurance is probably going to be lacking. Their range of motion will be lacking. So it's easier for them to compensate. But these are endurance muscles. You would like to get up slow and control between 8 to 12 repetitions. And if somebody gets to the point where they're doing well, you could do both arms at the same time, but have them focus on one at a time, because there's going to be different compensations and different ranges of motion potentially. So you're really going to want to kind of map those out. But, I highly recommend getting through these. It's worth it. This should be something you see them doing in the corner before they work with you.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So some of the common mistakes, I've mentioned those, is bending the elbow mid-repetition, hiking the shoulders, rushing the reps with no intention. You'll see other compensations, low back arch, whatever compensations you saw in the overhead squat, you'll see them here as well. So some of those cues and fixes, like Wendy mentioned in the other mobility drills, is just, imagine your arm is a joystick and your body's frozen in place. So only the arm is moving, nothing else. Teaching them that, postural, position of their spine. So drive down through your rib cage to kind of lock your core. Slow it down. Slower, better. 5 seconds up, 5 seconds down. So we want that to those tempos that really burn.
Everybody likes to feel the burn.
Looks easy, not so easy.
Well, and I love this one because this one's called If You Guys Are Driving and Not Watching, which, first of all, we appreciate you listening. But if you're thinking about these exercises, the next one is a deep squat hold when you're at the bottom. And so I know there's a lot of different variations to do this, but my favorite part is to think, when you go to some different countries, they're sitting into a squat and they're holding a conversation, and that's just what's comfortable for them, because they have unbelievable range of motion of the hip, of the knee, and of the ankle. And so them sitting into a squat is nothing. This is something I'm working a lot with one of my clients who is starting to get older and still thinks he's an athlete, like an elite athlete, and telling him that we're in retirement. And so things are going to start to stiffen up. And so, I'll have them do what we call like froggies, which is basically they go as deep as they can, they straighten their knees, and they come back into this position. But if you look at a baby, that's what's normal for them. When they're sitting down and they're just learning to walk, they actually sit into this like deep squat position, and it's because they can, and because they can, it's comfortable, and they're also close to the ground. So working on the deep squat and holding it, if you're tight and your lateral gastroc, if you're tight in your hips, it's really hard to get, first of all, your feet to stay straight. So some people do have to start externally rotated, and then eventually we're trying to bring them in to where they can do this with straighter feet. Most people in the beginning cannot. Another thing that is very common is people really have a lot of trouble disassociating different joints within their body. So getting their pelvis to kind of go downward and not sticking straight out. So what we're trying to do is keep an upright torso and sit into it. So some of the common, obviously, mistakes will be the heels come up because they are lacking sensibility in their calf complex, or depending on what's happening at the knees and the hip, their knees may cave in. So we definitely don't want that. Of course, passive rounding of the spine. So they're going to round their lower back just to try to get down in that position. When in all reality, again, we want to think we're trying to have an upright torso. We're trying to keep our back nice and flat, and try to think about getting the tailbone to dive down into the floor. I think that's usually another cue that I use. And you also don't want them bouncing or just hanging out at the bottom. I mean, if you're doing this for mobility work, we want to be able to move through these range of motions at a very controlled, specific pace. Now, again, some people will use cues such as screw your feet into the ground, try to think about, getting down into dropping their pelvis, push your knees out to match your toes. So again, alignment is always going to be key, so we don't put stress on the joint, and stay tall. So think proud chest, active torso. I always usually say, just think about, the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. I want you to sit back and drop your butt down, and let's see where we are. And if they're rounding, I give them cues to fix it.
Yeah, I'm working on this one. I'm getting better. I'm not to this position that you see here yet, but it's improved.
Improvement is every day, right?
Right. And then finally, the last one, Wendy, that we're going to talk about today is the cat-cow spinal segmentation. This is one I do all the time. It's just important to be able to articulate the different positions of your spine. It feels, and I do this one before I get into the deep squat. Go figure. Try to get that low back moving a little bit. So I think a lot of people have seen the cat-cow. They understand it. It's just doing it properly. Now, the picture I found, the best one I could find here, she has incredible range of motion, especially in the downward position. You could almost argue maybe she's going too far. That's not as common, but it was really hard to find a perfect picture. So some of the common mistakes is moving through lumbar only, not getting all of the spine to move into flexion and extension, speeding through the reps without focus, and then not breathing and having these movements out of sync. Also, for me, I like to push into the ground to try to activate the serratus anterior, make sure that my shoulder blades aren't just collapsing. So some of the cues and fixes is, try to move one vertebrae at a time, like a wave, and you're not snapping your spine. It's supposed to be a gentle, calm movement as you go segment by segment. Inhale to extend your spine, and exhale to flex. So you're moving in and out with your breath. So it's a good time to teach them these deep diaphragmatic breathing techniques. And then tucking your pelvis, as you go under, and that's what helps me get that pelvis moving a little bit before I go into a deep squat. And then lift your low ribs last, and then break that habit of rushing. So you'll see this a lot in yoga, but I think a lot of our weightlifters probably should spend a little more time doing all of these. These aren't just yoga type things. These are great mobility drills that will help you with any part of your fitness journey. So I highly recommend implementing all of these.
Yes.
That's it.
All right,
so
Marty.
Got Wendy, nothing? Okay.
Well, you know what? I wish I could say yes or no. I mean, I should probably implement those more than I do as well. Everyone's kind of has their own mobility drills. I mean, I do.
Wendy.
I know I do a lot of, L spine locked with thoracic
Mhm.
rotation. I try to get my spine to move as well. And that's just it. Everyone kind of has their mobility drills that are going to work for them. And, if some of these maybe are just like triggering, well, you know what? I usually don't do the world's greatest stretch, or I don't do what Wendy calls the windshield wipers or the 90-90s for internal, external rotation. Maybe it's just things that you can implement or add, especially if you know that your clients are lacking some of these. But hopefully the kind of key takeaways is, do you have intention and attention? So the intention and attention to detail when performing and instructing these drills. Again, it's all about the quality of the movement. And we're trying to make sure that even though we're going through movement and there is some momentum, it's slow motion, there's intention, and we're trying to actually get range of motion through the joint that we're focused on. You want to be able to demonstrate the mobility exercises with proper form. So if you haven't done any of these and then you're like, hey, I heard on this podcast this thing called the world's greatest stretch, let's try it, and you don't know what you're doing because there are a lot of parts, that's not the best way of approaching that. So just make sure that whatever mobility drills you're doing with your clients, some people do a lot of threading the needles, anything like that to get some, for example, thoracic extension, just make sure you're doing it correctly and following the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints or whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. It's all about show telling and doing. I'm very visual. So I would say, hey, can you show me what you're talking about? And then, as we always say, it's always about form and technique. If they're not really there yet, find a way to modify it. And then maybe in the next session, find out if there's a different mobility drill that might be better for them at that time, and then come back to it.
Great advice, Wendy. So hopefully everybody enjoyed this episode. But Wendy, we love to hear from our followers. So can you give them your contact information?
100%. If you guys want to reach out to me, you can find me on Instagram at wendy.batts or wendy.batts13. And then if you want to email me, you can go to wendy.batts@nasm.org.
And my info is right here, dr.martymiller72, and email marty.miller@nasm.org. So Wendy, thanks for all your great advice. For all of you that joined us on this episode of the Master Instructor Roundtable, we can't thank you enough. Make sure you like, follow, and subscribe. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.